The transatlantic slave trade stands as one of the darkest chapters in human history. Millions of Africans were forcibly transported across the Atlantic, enduring unimaginable horrors and subjected to centuries of brutal enslavement. Please subscribe to my channel, share, and click the like button. This narrative has been widely documented, studied, and acknowledged as a pivotal force in shaping the Americas. However, a lesser-known, yet equally disturbing parallel narrative exists: the enslavement of the Irish people. While the horrors of the African slave trade cannot be overstated, the history of Irish slavery remains largely obscured. This essay seeks to shed light on this often overlooked aspect of history. It aims to explore the experiences of the Irish, who, like their African counterparts, were victims of forced migration, brutal treatment, and systematic oppression. Understanding the history of Irish slavery is crucial. It adds a vital dimension to our understanding of the transatlantic slave trade. It also reveals the complex interplay of race, power, and economics that fueled colonial expansion and exploitation. By bringing the history of Irish slavery to the forefront, we gain a more comprehensive understanding of the forces that shaped the Americas. We also acknowledge the suffering and resilience of a people whose stories deserve to be told and remembered. To understand the roots of Irish slavery, we must turn our attention to the 16th and 17th centuries. During this period, England, under the rule of monarchs like Queen Elizabeth I and King James I, embarked on an aggressive campaign of colonial expansion. Ireland, a land rich in resources and strategically positioned, became a prime target for English ambitions. English authorities viewed the native Irish population with suspicion and disdain. They saw the Irish as culturally inferior and a threat to their colonial ambitions. To solidify their control over Ireland, the English crown implemented a series of policies designed to subdue and displace the native Irish population. One of the most impactful of these policies was the plantation system. Under this system, vast tracts of Irish land were confiscated from their rightful owners and granted to English colonists. These colonists, often motivated by profit and the promise of a new life, established large-scale agricultural enterprises. The success of these plantations depended on a readily available and inexpensive labor force. The displacement of the Irish from their ancestral lands created a large pool of desperate and vulnerable people. These displaced Irish men, women, and children became prime targets for exploitation. They were coerced, tricked, or outright kidnapped and forced into servitude, marking the beginning of the Irish slave trade. The forced removal of the Irish from their lands created a lucrative opportunity for English merchants and landowners. With a surplus of displaced and desperate Irish people, a new form of human trafficking emerged: the Irish slave trade. This trade saw tens of thousands of Irish men, women, and children shipped across the Atlantic to work as indentured servants and slaves in England's burgeoning colonies. The primary destinations for these Irish captives were the Caribbean islands, particularly Barbados, Montserrat, and Jamaica. These islands were undergoing a rapid transformation into sugar-producing colonies. The labor-intensive nature of sugar cultivation created an insatiable demand for cheap and expendable workers. Irish slaves were also shipped to the American colonies, though in smaller numbers initially. They labored on tobacco plantations in Virginia and Maryland and worked as domestic servants and laborers in other colonies. The conditions they faced were often brutal and inhumane. The Irish slave trade was characterized by its brutality and exploitation. Irish men, women, and children were rounded up like cattle, branded with hot irons, and packed onto overcrowded ships. The journey across the Atlantic, known as the Middle Passage, was a horrific ordeal. Many perished from disease, starvation, or the sheer brutality of their captors. Section 4. Across the Atlantic: the brutal reality of Irish servitude. The horrors endured by Irish slaves did not end upon reaching the shores of the New World. In fact, their arrival often marked the beginning of a life filled with hardship, abuse, and despair. The vast majority of Irish slaves were sold to plantation owners, who viewed them as little more than disposable commodities. Life on a sugar plantation was grueling and unforgiving. Irish slaves toiled under the relentless Caribbean sun, clearing land, planting, harvesting and processing sugarcane. The work was backbreaking, dangerous, and often resulted in injuries or death. They were routinely overworked, malnourished, and denied basic medical care. Those who ended up as domestic servants or laborers in the American colonies fared little better. They faced long hours, harsh treatment, and the constant threat of physical or sexual abuse. Escape was nearly impossible, and resistance was met with swift and brutal punishment. The mortality rate among Irish slaves was staggeringly high. Many succumbed to disease, exhaustion, malnutrition, or the brutality of their overseers. The average lifespan of an Irish slave in the Caribbean was a mere 7 years. Section 5. Parallel oppressions, comparing and contrasting Irish and African slavery. Both Irish and African slaves endured unimaginable horrors, but there were key differences in their treatment and status. Africans were viewed as chattel slaves, property for life, while Irish were indentured servants. Indentured servants were bound for a set period, typically 5 to 7 years. Many Irish servants never lived to see their freedom. Children of Irish slaves were often born into servitude, perpetuating forced labor. A racial hierarchy placed Europeans at the top and Africans at the bottom. This ideology justified the massive enslavement of Africans. Irish slaves faced brutal treatment but were not dehumanized solely based on race. Section 6. Shifting Sands, the decline of Irish slavery and the rise of the transatlantic slave trade. By the late 17th century, the dynamics of the transatlantic slave trade began to shift. The demand for labor in the Americas continued to grow, particularly with the expansion of sugar, tobacco, and cotton production. At the same time, the supply of Irish slaves began to dwindle. Several factors contributed to this decline. Firstly, the English crown, facing pressure from Irish landowners and fearing rebellion, began to implement policies aimed at curbing the export of Irish slaves. Secondly, the rise of the transatlantic African slave trade provided a more readily available and, in the eyes of colonial planners, a more profitable source of labor. African slaves, unlike their Irish counterparts, were viewed as chattel slaves, meaning their status as property was absolute and lifelong. This made them a more attractive investment for slave owners, as they could extract labor from them for their entire lives and pass them down to their heirs. The racial ideology that underpinned the transatlantic slave trade further solidified the shift away from Irish slavery. Africans, deemed racially inferior and suited for hard labor, were increasingly seen as the ideal slave labor force. This racialized system of slavery would tragically define the next century of American history.